Welcome to the Boardroom, a series of exclusive masterclasses delivered by leading Sheffield alumni for our 2020 graduates. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the series, Clive Humby, OBE, Chief Data Scientist at StarCount. And Clive will be talking to us this evening all about consumer data and insights.
I've got a short presentation. It's really my story, a little bit about some of the things I've done. I've kept away from the heavy maths because I went through the CVs and realized not everyone would be interested in the detailed methods that I use. Most of them were learned at Sheffield, although I have since then developed a number of new methods of my own. My methodologies have been widely used around the world by a wide number of organizations. Right now, this is where I show how terrible I am at technology. I'm going to share my screen. Lovely. So I've made my entire career understanding people through data. And we hear a lot about, you know, the big data boys of today, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Apples, who get a lot of data about customers from technology. And certainly technology has changed a huge amount what is able to be done with data and with understanding customers. So I thought it would be worth looking at what's really changed over 45 years and how that change has made a big difference to organizations. And so just tell me a little bit about myself. I was the first of my family to go to university. I'm from Leicester originally, come from a very working class background. My dad was a builder. My mum was a school dinner lady. I did mathematics at A level, and I got into my first choice university, Sheffield, where I did applied maths and computer science. And it's worth reflecting on what sort of has changed for me. So I left. I took the safe option when I left university and joined British Gas as a graduate trainee. Quickly found out it wasn't for me. I didn't suit a big organization. And I then joined a company called CACI in Bermuda as a programmer analyst. And put the thing into context, when I graduated, my graduate salary was £2,800 a year. And I saw this amazing job advertised for a contract in Bermuda for $28,000. Those days, the dollar was about 2.5 to the pound. So that was sort of about 10 grand, which was a lot of money for me. And I decided to give it a go. And I think the first lesson there is sometimes you just have to take a big risk. I'd never been abroad before. I hadn't even got a passport. I joined the company and I stayed with that company until 1989. I came back to the UK after my contract ended and set up a division which did what we call site location, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. I became a senior vice president and ran the entire marketing analysis team in Europe in 1985. And in 1989, I left with my partner. I met a lady called Edwina Dunn at CACI. We married, and we saw the future as analysing bigger data than CACI was analysing, and we formed dunnhumby. We had that company for about 20 years, and we sold that company to Tesco in 2011. And since that time, I've been doing some interesting new stuff, which I'll touch on at the end. But these are probably the big events. And sometimes you have to look at what events defined your career. And this may look a very odd list, but these are the things when I was thinking about talking to you, these were the things that really generated my career and drove it to where it is today. First one's a very strange one: the abolition of the draft after the Vietnam War. And the reason that was so important was when the draft was abolished, you could no longer just send out a letter and say you're in the army now. You had to attract people. You had to market the army. And in fact, that was my first job at CACI. CACI was a big defense contractor, and I helped build a model that predicted how many recruits they would get if they opened an army recruiting station in different suburbs of major cities. And that was about understanding people through where they lived. So it was about looking at the demography, the age mix, the educational achievements, the car ownership, the income levels of different groups of people, and building predictive models to predict what would happen if you opened an honorary recruiting station. That really started a whole industry called Geodemographics. And a gentleman called Richard Webber, at the time he was at Liverpool University, published a paper on the idea of classifying neighborhoods over a wide number of variables using a mathematical technique called cluster analysis. And he fused that with market research and showed it was powerful. At the time, I led a team of about 18 programmers, and we were building individual mathematical models to predict all sorts of things about demand in local areas. And that basically drove a shortcut to basically allow the business to grow really quickly. Can't leave out marrying my business partner. We formed an amazing team. We complement each other brilliantly. And again, sometimes that is a powerful thing to say. I don't think I could have gone it alone on my own. And I don't think Edwina could have gone it alone on her own either. But in 1989, we decided to quit CSCI, and the two of us formed a business called dunnhumby. We gradually grew to about 30 people over the next 5 years, and then we met Tesco, who were just trialing Clubcard. I'm sure you know what Clubcard is. Basically, it's a loyalty card. You go to the supermarket, you present it when you finish your shopping, and you get some points, and later on you get some vouchers. That relationship started to drive massive growth in our business. We grew from 30 people to about 150 people. And then in 2000, we convinced Tesco that actually its suppliers, people like Coca-Cola and Procter & Gamble, would usually benefit from understanding the people that bought their products. And that basically drove a massive growth in our business. And the second thing that drove massive growth was we met with an American retailer very similar to Tesco called Kroger, and they invited us to do exactly the same thing in America. And the thing that's very important is to recognize why all this could happen. When I started at Sheffield bought a new computer in the maths department. It was a small mini computer. It didn't cost $400,000, but the equivalent of the memory in that computer would have cost you $400,000 per megabyte of memory. Today, the cost of the same amount of memory is 0.3 cents. So that's what, a 12 million-fold change over that time. And in a way, that reflects the challenge of data. So when I started my career at CSCI, we were dealing with about 50 million pieces of data. And I'll explain that in a little bit more detail as I go on. When we moved to Clubcard, we were dealing with 10 billion items of data to make sense of what people bought. And today at StarCount, where we're analyzing social media data and the social graph, we're dealing with 28 trillion bits of data to understand patterns. And the thing that's enabled all of that to happen over that time is the massive power of Moore's law, which says computing gets cheaper and cheaper exponentially, and storage gets cheaper and cheaper exponentially. And that's been the phenomenon that's led to the growth of big data. When I started my career, I don't know how many of you know the TV program Mad Men, but basically marketing was all about the advertising agency. There were these really smooth, slick individuals who bought and sold television and newspaper advertising, made vast fortunes by taking a 10 or 15% commission in doing so, and built all of those iconic ads that people loved and enjoyed. And we, as a little small company at CSCI, were basically saying, this is all wrong. You need to understand customers better. Effectively, TV advertising was bought based on your age and your demographic, what job you did, basically. But understanding customers today is really hard. I mean, if you think about the amount of data Apple or Facebook or Instagram or Google have about you, it's a phenomenal amount of data. There are more and more channels, more and more data, more and more interactions, and you as individuals are behaving much differently, much more quickly. One of the things we looked at, we did an interesting little study where we looked at people who started following universities and all those sorts of things in their social graph. And then we looked at what they were following 4 years later, and guess what? It was job markets and stuff like that. And then we looked at what they were following 2 years later, and it was a completely different list of things and showed how their lives were changing. And what was interesting, so that social data was telling us a story about what people were doing and how it was all changing. In 2006, I coined the term data is the new oil. And I really coined that term to basically describe the process of extracting and refining data to make it useful in understanding customers. Actually, most data that is created in business is not created for the benefit of the customer. It's actually generated by business processes designed to do things like supply chain, getting products from the depot to the warehouse to the store, or transactions in that process, etc. It's actually not designed to describe customers. If you think about it, when you pick up a bag of frozen chips and put them in your shopping basket, what the supermarket understands is they're frozen, their vegetables, and their price point. But what we were interested in is what you were putting them with and how you were making meals out of them. And that's actually, although that's ultimately what the supermarkets were trying to do, the actual behavior of customers was not being measured through the items they picked. We had to basically create what we call metadata, data that describe the data itself. So we described a bag of McCain's oven chips not as, they need freezing, they need transportation, they weigh 42 grams or whatever. We said it's a part of an ingredient, it tends to be part of a cooked meal, there are typically 16 portions in the pack. So all the things that the consumer is thinking when they're buying them. And one of our tricks was we developed an algorithm called the rolling ball that basically allowed us to group together products that were frequently bought together. So we understood that rhubarb and custard went together, or strawberries and cream, etc., etc. And that allowed us, for example, to look for what we call holes in the basket. When you bought the strawberries but not the cream, when you bought the rhubarb but not the custard. And a lot of what we were doing was basically trying to find those holes in baskets and suggesting that you filled them in our communications. So if we look at a timeline of what I've learned over my career, when Mad Men was starting in the 1960s, your demographics were the job you did. I'm sure you've heard of ABC1 adults, which are basically the sort of upper half of the population. And it's basically saying you are the job you do. The thing we developed in CSCI was what we call geodemographics. And this is the idea of you are where you live. So basically the neighborhood in which you live starts to tell a story about you. Now, obviously, you look at your next door neighbor and they are not necessarily the same person as you. But what you do tend to find is you get congregations of people that basically reflect a lifestyle, and collectively you can understand the differences, and that's much more valuable than just doing that one job. By the 1990s, when we were working with Tesco, it was you are what you buy. So the things that you chose to put in your shopping basket told us a story. And if you think about my job was really sitting in your kitchen, watch you unpack your groceries and looking at that over time and basically working out how you lived your life. I could work out if you were trying to lose weight. I could work out if you were on a fitness regime. I could work out if you were trying to feed a family on a low budget. I could work out whether you treated yourself to expensive wine but bought the cheapest loo roll, and all of these different things. And understanding what you did became extremely powerful and really made, if you like, my success and made me the success in dunnhumby. What we're doing now is we're looking at passions and mindsets based on what you follow in social media. So this is you are what you love rather than you are what you buy. We're using very similar mathematical techniques, but the data set is much more complex. There are many more items, as it were, that you could buy or you could follow. We look at a graph of about 400,000 stars, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. And basically, we believe this is going to be the next phase of what most companies can do. So let's just have a look at each of those in the journey. So you are where you live. And you know, you've all heard of, I mean, there are whole TV genres dedicated to this. You know, The Only Way is Essex, you know, Chelsea Babes or whatever it's called. And there's various programs that basically look at different lifestyles just based on a very simple idea of a very broad region. But what we were doing is much more detailed than that. We were basically classifying individual streets based on the demography of that street. So the data we got was from what's called the census, and looked at basically the behavior of people in market research terms to about 400 questions about their household composition. And the data that we got for, information for was for a unit of about 50 to 60 households. And we were able to classify each street based on the mix of people. And that was used to understand outdoor advertising, programmatic targeting, catchment areas of stores and drive times, and the immediate vicinities of stores. And that whole area became a major industry. And I was very lucky to be in the beginning of that industry and see it grow. And in fact, write many of the original algorithms that did things like gravity models that work out drive times and catchment areas of stores. Then along came Clubcard. And as I said, the previous technique used about 50 million data points to really understand people. Clubcard generated a lot more than that, about 10 billion data points, 10 million people. And basically what I did was I looked at what you put in your shopping basket each week and how you behaved. And the things that we were really interested in were how promotionally promiscuous you were. Did you switch brands readily if different brands were on promotion, or were you always loyal? We found, for example, people tend to be very loyal to their favorite toothpaste and their favorite coffee, but are quite happy to switch brands of crisps or brands of beer when they're on promotion. And so by understanding those patterns, we could basically give you offers that generated one more item in the basket, one more visit in the month, and very quickly those one more items and one more visits generate a lot of additional value. I'll show you a little bit about the journey that Tesco went on. In 1995, when we basically launched the system, the trial had been in 1994. By 1997, we'd identified that they needed what's now called the express format, the much smaller format, because people were buying smaller and smaller baskets. We developed and launched the whole of Tesco Finest in the late 90s. Tesco Finest is now a bigger brand than Coca-Cola in the UK. In 2000, we launched Tesco.com, and probably the most important thing that we found in that exercise was by showing you the things that you already bought, by basically allowing you to put your existing club card in and pre-populating your favorites list, we doubled click-through rates in terms of the things that people bought. And I won't go through all of these, and obviously you'll be able to reflect back on the presentation. But basically, we went on a journey where we developed more and more things for customers. And nearly every single one of these was informed by very detailed analysis of what people were doing and their reaction when we launched products. It shortened product launch life cycles from 13 to 26 weeks down to 4 to 8 weeks because we could understand very quickly repeat purchase rates. It allowed us to develop Tesco Mobile and Tesco Finance very, very quickly, which became major businesses in their own right because we could see which customers took the products and we could understand how much more loyal it made them to Tesco. And that's allowed us to price the products very competitively. So how much was that loyalty worth? Well, over the first 10 years that we worked with Tesco, we estimated we drove £60 billion worth of additional sales. Which, if you think about it, for a team of about 100 data scientists working supporting Tesco, is quite amazing. And probably the most important quote we heard, and this was right at the beginning, when we were doing the trial of Tesco Clubcard, we had the data for 3 months, and we came in and basically told the board at the time what we discovered about their customers through the shopping baskets we're able to look at. And the then Tesco leader, Lord McLaurin, said, "You know more about my customers after 3 months than I know after 30 years. And in a way, that sums up what data was able to do. We were at the cutting edge. We were doing things that really pushed the limits of the technology at the time. In fact, we were using quite a lot of statistical sampling techniques because memory was too expensive to do this on 100% of data. So we would take 10 or 15% samples, build the algorithms, and then see how many people in the 100% base had those patterns." We did a very similar thing with Kroger in America. And for them, they basically generated about $70 billion. Rodney, who led Kroger, Rodney McMullen, basically, when we first talked to Kroger, in their board call to investors, the word customer did not appear at all. Today, customer is in everything they do. They have a customer-first strategy designed to basically focus on what customers want to drive value. And again, a massive change to a major organization. And this was our story along that. So Edwina and I formed dunnhumby in 1989. When we launched with Tesco in 1995, we were about 30 people. We grew to about 140 with Tesco alone. And then we basically convinced them to share their insights with their suppliers. And over the course of the next 20 years, as it were, we grew the business to about 1,500 people in 30 markets around the world, and basically started a new industry. Today, there are probably 6 companies like dunnhumby, all serving different parts of the grocery industry. We weren't allowed to work with Sainsbury's, so guess what? Someone did. Interestingly, 4 of those 6 companies are all led by people who started their career with Edwina and I. And again, that makes me very proud that we started a whole industry. But there are going to be winners and losers. And today, the landscape is changing rapidly, and data is the principal reason that things are changing. And people say, what's Amazon going to do to the grocers? Amazon announced this week, in fact, that they were extending their free delivery for fresh, and that is going to basically undermine the current business models of many of the current retailers. And obviously, Amazon have a huge advantage in the Amazon Prime that customers pay their £80 a year for, or whatever. Excuse me. Generates a huge amount of data on the customer beyond what they do in grocery. And one of the interesting questions, of course, is grocery data is fantastic for understanding customers because it's so frequent in its transaction. But if you're selling electrical goods, or you're selling clothing, or you're selling shoes, or you're selling fashion, the number of transactions you have are very, very much smaller. And so you are severely disadvantaged, and you have to go to the people who've got a lot of data. Either go to the Amazons and go onto their marketplace, where they can basically understand what else you buy and market for the organization, or you go to Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and you advertise to people based on their social media behaviors. It's very hard to basically understand the customer unless you've got those high frequency transactions. And Amazon's control of this vast cache of data is basically going to give it an unprecedented advantage in new markets, and something that basically nearly every other business needs to be very concerned by. And you only have to look at how well Amazon has done during this lockdown period, growing sales by over 35%, to realize how much power a really powerful, really well-run organization with immense sources of data can do when things in the marketplace are tough. But also how we shop is changing. When we started working, most people were basically shopping on buying things on a commodity basis. But today you've got stores designed for Instagram. The dressing room on the left-hand side here in this picture basically is designed so that you can share your new dress, your new clothes with your friends and make a decision about it without even leaving the store. And in fact, there's a retailer in China at the moment that's experimenting with changing the price of the goods depending on how many people like them whilst you're in the store, which is incredible. And likewise, QR codes and all sorts of things are now very popular in particularly Asian supermarkets, where basically people can scan and understand different recipes that the product can be used in. So we basically decided to come out of retirement. When we sold dunnhumby, Edwina and I were going to retire, but we decided we would do more, and we basically came up with the idea of you are what you love. And if you think about it, the things that you follow on social media tell us so much about what you like, what you're interested in, and we believe that that basically can help us help organizations beat the Amazons ultimately. So we've moved away from Mad Men, and we think now that we're in the power of a data-driven culture, and so now it's all about the math men, if you pardon the pun. But actually, it's getting really hard, because actually the thing that's changed is we originally mostly worked with single source data. So information that came from one place. So for example, with CSCI and Geodemographics, it was about where people lived and the demographics. In shopping, it was about the things you chose to put in your shopping basket. But basically, the new technology demands bigger, always-on data. So the first thing we've done is we've basically started mining social media data. And we basically what we've done is we've identified the 350 or 1,000 or so biggest stars. So everything from the Kardashians down to brands, media titles, etc. And we look at what 1 billion consumers around the world follow amongst those stars. And typically, the average person follows 50 of the stars that we identify globally. I'm going to skip this slide because it's quite long, but basically what it allows us to do, it allows us to understand what people are passionate about in different places at different times. And we can track this in real time because we're mining this data actively. So in this particular case, the area that we're highlighting is more tech savvy, style conscious, travel enthusiasts, culture curious. They like TV entertainment, news and current affairs, comedy. You get the basic idea. I won't go through this in a lot of detail because it's actually quite a long video, and I'm very conscious of the time. But what we end up being able to understand is basically the passions of people. And here I've picked a couple of passions connected with the 15 pillars that the UN are looking at in terms of things that matter. And so we've identified people, for example, who follow things to do with zero waste, so recycling, sustainability. We've looked at the websites and the brands and the media and the companies that these people tend to follow. And we looked at the words they tend to use in their descriptions. And we've done something similar with, in this particular case, mental well-being. And we can understand basically the sorts of places they get their information, the sorts of things that drive their behavior, and then we can go and find them and do things. What's important about what we're doing now is we can do this anywhere in the world. So if you look at these two maps, this is the relative importance of those two issues anywhere in the world. And when we say anywhere in the world, we can't get data from China or North Vietnam because of the firewalls those countries have put up around social media. So what will the future bring? Well, it's no longer what you can do. When we started, most of the things we were doing were cutting edge, but weren't particularly intrusive. I mean, sending you a promotion for a yogurt that you liked or your favorite toothpaste was generally speaking supported by most consumers. There's always been a small vocal minority that think knowing anything about anyone is dangerous. But for the most part, if you use data well, then customers tend to be very supportive. But I think we've reached the tipping point, and I think we have to basically think about what we should do and what we shouldn't do, as well as what we could do. And there we've got to balance ethics and innovation to really understand what consumers want to get out of the data about them and what they don't. We all hate it when we're stalked in any way. We're not talking about sinister stalking. I mean, even things like getting an offer for a cup of coffee from Starbucks as you walk by can feel a bit spooky. And so basically, we very much believe in this, the sentence, it's got to be cool, not creepy. And that's very much where we're focusing now. And in fact, Edwina is now sitting on a council that's looking at the ethics of data use to try and basically steer governments in the right direction in terms of what is ethical versus unethical, rather than what is prohibited and not prohibited, which is what we currently have with GDPR, the data protection. But it won't stop. I'm sure all of you are aware of the Internet of Things. We all have smart devices, whether it's the Fitbit on our wrist, the new electric cycle we've had, the navigation system in our car, the smart TV that we've started watching everything on. All of these things are collecting data at a prolific rate, and we're seeing literally petabytes, which is a mind-bogglingly large number of data generated constantly. And as those things start to cross-reference through their device IDs and other things, their internet addresses, we start being able to build incredibly detailed pictures of how people live their lives, what they're doing. And that's where basically the ethics start to come in. And the explosion in data that I've seen in my career is getting faster and faster. In fact, I quite often describe everything changing now in dog years. What I mean by that is we see more change in 1 year now than we saw in 7 when I started. I think also I may go back to my roots, because I think one of the ways of thinking about a lot of this new data is in the geography of things. What things are nearby, what things are located together. If you think about consumption, you can only buy things from places that exist, other than obviously on the internet. So actually, as the shape of the high street changes, and it's going to change dramatically as a result of the current lockdown, actually geography will start to feature again as a major activity in terms of determining what is good and what is bad. So I think almost certainly the Internet of Things and the geography of things will become two of the major topics for data analysis. and improving marketing and understanding customers over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's it from me. If you want to find out more, drop us an email at team@starcount.com. We'd be delighted to hear from you. And I hope that's given you a feel for how a Sheffield graduate 40 odd years ago has gone from a very simple mathematician trying to work out what he could do for a career to building a global company and carry on pioneering. Oh, I like to think I am. 45 years on. So thank you very much, and let's take some questions, and I'll come back on to the sharing. I'll stop my screen.
Thank you so much, Clive, for that very insightful presentation there. Really interesting to hear, you know, your career journey and your insight into that topic and your personal experience as well. So thank you so much. Before we pick up any questions that might come into the chat, and feel free to keep adding those. As I said, we had quite a lot of questions sent in advance, so we'd like to try and pick some of those out for you just to kick things off. So Stephanie Taverner, you had a question about how data is collected. Are you there, Stephanie? Can you unmute your mic and ask your question?
Yeah, of course. Hi, I'm Stephanie, and I've just graduated in international business management. So my question was, how do you ensure the data that is collected is sort of meaningful and can drive insight to fuel sort of the business decisions? So I think that's been covered as well, but how can you ensure that that data does drive the insight that the business actually wants?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I go back to my point. Data is often collected for a different reason originally. It's collected for a business process. One of the things we found is you have to transform the data to basically make it into something that tells a story. We have a process we call DIAL, which is data, insight, action, loyalty. And what a lot of organizations forget to do is the insight. They think because they've got a lot of data, they can go and do things. I mean, a great example of that is, you know, we buy something and then we instantly get an advert for buying something else that's allegedly related. You know, one of the most simple examples is collaborative filtering, which basically means you've just bought this pair of shoes. Most people who bought that pair of shoes also bought these socks. And it's sort of okay, but actually I might not want any socks. So I think one of the really challenging things is you have to learn to understand the business that you're working on. To be a great data analyst is not about being, I'm not the greatest mathematician, I'm not the greatest statistician, but I'm great at being able to relate to the business problem and working out how to use the data to solve that problem. And that's the real skill of a great data analyst. It is not being the best at building the model. I would much rather have a simple model that my clients can understand than a complicated model that basically loses them but is 10% better mathematically. So I don't know if that answers your question well, but that's my best attempt.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you. George Butler, you had a question about leadership. Could I ask you to invite you to ask your question, please, George?
Hi. Thanks for taking the time to talking to us. I don't remember the question on leadership. I thought mine was...
Yeah, no problem, George. You asked about, the question you asked was what influenced Clive's leadership style and how it might have changed over the past 30 years.
Okay. I was very fortunate to join a company called CACI, which was formed by a remarkable man called Herb Carr. And that company had what was called Herb's Homilies. It was basically 39 rules, as it were, or ideas, but often conflicting, that he basically believed made a great company. And Edwina and I were very lucky in that we both worked there. We both picked up this mindset. I think you have to work, So I think the things that I've always felt important, always work with and hire people better than you. That's very important. You basically, there's no point being the star of the show. You want to be, if you want to be a great leader, you lead by basically bringing people together with good skills and letting them gel off each other. The other thing to recognize is that you really have to build on I think a lot of companies focus on improving the bad traits of their employees. We believe greatly in backing the things you are good at. We developed this methodology we called the power of two. And basically what we did is we put teams of two people together who were highly complementary. And if you imagine there are, say, 25 major skills that you need to have to run a successful business, covering everything from understanding the client, etc. Actually, if you're good at 5 to 6 of the 25, if you put someone with you who's good at another 5 to 6 of the 25, and that is the core team, you've got half the bases covered. And we apply that philosophy very strongly. Every single market we launched in, my favorite story about that was when we launched dunnhumby Italia, we were working with a retailer called Pam, and we got a phone call back from the managing director and said, these two young boys that you sent to run this business for us, he said that we really like them and they're very clever, but they're very young. You know, we don't think we've got the best people. And we said, well, actually you have. Between them, they've got these skills, and actually collectively between them, they've got 15 years of experience in what we do, which is about 12 years experience more than anyone else that you could find. And they turned out, those two guys basically built amazing business in that country in less than 3 years. And that was purely driven by the fact that they were such good complementary.
Thank you, Clive, and thank you for that question, George. Jen Selim, you had a question about data and security risks. Are you able to ask that one for us, please, Jen?
Yep. Hi, my question was, with the growth of technology bringing data security risks, how have you maintained the confidence of your clients?
That's another great question. I mean, I think I've talked a little bit about data and ethics, and I think that's very important. So just as an example, we have created a very strong encryption methodology that encrypts all the data that we harvest from social media on ingestion. So the only thing that we really understand is the stars themselves. Anyone who follows those stars is doubly obfuscated through our ingestion process, which basically means that we can tell very strong stories, but have no idea who the end person behind it is. And actually for marketing, you're not really interested in any one individual. What you really want to know is there are 100,000 people who might do this, and that's enough to make a marketing decision to spend that money. The only time you need to know who they are is if you're doing one-to-one communication. And we always reduce our one-to-one communication to things that people have effectively. GDPR has been fantastic for that. So GDPR is the current data protection regulations. Basically, it's fully consensual. So basically, unless someone says you can use this data to send me the relevant mailing or the relevant communication or the relevant ad, we're not allowed to do it. So what we do is we basically act as the honest broker. We tell the client the business rules they need to apply on their database, but we don't know who they apply to. And so that gives the client a great degree of confidence that basically we are whiter than white in the GDPR sense.
Thank you, Clive. Thank you for that question. Mohammed Salim, you had an interesting question about sort of starting out on the data journey. Could you ask your question, please, Mohammed? Have we got Mohammed there? Have you got your, if you're there, make sure your mic's turned on. No problem. We'll move to another question.
Hello.
Oh, sorry, you are there. On you go.
Right. So I've worked with the company before. Moving on to the Internet of Things, they were designing something with hydraulic pumps going on, and they were working with a company who would give them that data insight. And that's where I realized not getting all the data is important. It's also important what you get out from the data. So because I don't have a background for someone who does data analytics, what would you suggest to be a starting point for someone who wants to understand data and how to get those insights from the data that you collect?
That's another good question. Thank you, Mohammed. I mean, I think the real challenge, I think, in terms of doing good data analysis is the thing I described about transforming data to make it useful. Nearly every data is faulty in some way. I mean, you know, for example, on my phone, I have an app called Fake GPS because I don't like people knowing where I am from a marketing point of view. I very happily share some data, but I'm very particular about what I do want to share. And so it's very important that you can spot data that is erroneous. So I think there are two basic rules in terms of using data well. First question is, what business processes are you trying to improve? Is it your marketing? Is it your manufacturing? And get to understand that process, because it's the process that you want to change, not the data. And then basically, when you build your models, make sure you build a contingency in. So when I was at Sheffield, I learned a lot about optimization and hill climbing methods. And basically, what you're really looking for is what I would call local maxima. And there's a fundamental difference between. There are two sorts of data analysis. One is what I would call descriptive, and that's really what I do. I do descriptive data analysis. I'm trying to tell stories with data that can be related to people who are not data literate and let them do things. The other one is what I would call predictive, and that's what we use, for example, if you're trying to predict if an engine's going to fail under certain conditions, or a person's going to default on a credit card, or things like that. And the two methodologies are quite fundamentally different. Storytelling is about finding patterns and explaining the patterns. Failure analysis, whether that be manufacturing like hydraulic pumps, or predicting someone who's going to default on their loan, that's more to do with basically risk modeling and then understanding the boundaries and limits of your model. And there are two very different things. With a risk-based model where you're doing predictive analytics, your inputs are much more important, because basically any variation in those means that your errors are going to be larger. So basically you work out which are the most important inputs and then prioritize them.
Lovely. Thank you for that, and thank you for that question. So Leanna Burrell, you had a question. I think Clive has already sort of touched on this in his presentation, but perhaps you could expand on it a little, Clive. Leanna has a question about looking to the future, really. Are you able to ask your question, Leanna?
Yeah, hi. My question was about consumer data regarding where do you think it is headed in the future compared to where it is now?
Yeah. Obviously, what's happening is you're getting a smaller and smaller number of very powerful companies. So basically, Alphabet, which is the Google business, and then Facebook, Instagram, obviously, Apple, Amazon. These companies control vast amounts of data. Much more than you even realize they have. I mean, the data resources they have are immense, because they do very clever things with the devices that you use to tell them things. I think there are three things that are changing. One, the cookie is going to go away. The cookie, which allows you to basically know that that device was also used to read the Daily Mail 3 days ago, the ability to mine cookies will disappear. GDPR basically points in that direction, which basically means anyone with real-time and high-frequency data on customers will become more powerful. Secondly, and perhaps a corollary to that, is the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things does not contain personal data. It's about the connections between objects and objects recording themselves. But actually, with clever data analysis, it can tell immensely powerful stories. So, for example, you can understand commuting patterns by looking at how many people's phones start in one location and end in another on a regular basis every day. You don't need to know the individual user. What you're interested in is that flow is 12,000 people or 15,000. And we're reaching the stage, I think, where data ethics will start having to think not just about what we understand about the individual consumer, but what we understand about collections of consumers. And that's going to be very hard for the regulators, I think. So that is, I think, is the next big challenge in data, is that actually data about groups of people start becoming more and more valuable.
Thank you, Clive. I think we have just one question in the chat, which flows on from that really and has been touched on because it is about ethics. So, Mohammed, would you like to just ask the question you've put in the chat there? Mohammed Salim.
Yeah, right. So in terms of real-time data, how ethical do you think? And I've read a book from Shoshana Zuboff writing about Internet of Things. How ethical do you think it is to monitor people in real time? And do you think people and governments are really concerned about it? There's been cases about things in Spain and other places in Europe, but there's nothing much that's being done in the UK particularly.
Yeah, I think, well, probably the most poignant example of that is track and trace at the moment for COVID. As you probably have heard, the government wanted to have an app that basically tracked who we'd all been in contact with for more than 30 seconds or whatever it was by using Bluetooth technology. That's a massive ethical dilemma. I think basically people will only be happy with using real-time data on a consent basis. So, for example, how do you feel about walking by Starbucks and because you've ticked the right box, getting an offer for a free coffee? And I think there are 2 points about this. One is what you do actively. Me giving you the offer of the free coffee, that you sort of say, okay, well, that can be consent-based. You know, if you don't want the offers, say no, and I won't give them to you. But the computer still knows your phone walked past Starbucks. And as you went through that geofence, the computer can tell that that phone appears at between 9 and 9:30 every morning on their way to work down that street. And what is the ethics of that? That's a really difficult question. And actually, in a way, Edwina would be a far better person to answer the question than I am. But I mean, this has really held up track and trace really badly in the UK. I mean, it's basically been something that has really worried people. And I think one of the interesting questions is, what's more important? Is it ethical to stop someone dying because they've got to get COVID? Or is it ethical of saying, I know that Clive met Mohammed for a coffee at Starbucks last week, and that's where the transmission took place? And that's a really interesting dilemma. And I don't know how many of you remember the film I, Robot with Will Smith. You know, and he's sort of part android, and he resented the fact that the computer decided to save him rather than a young girl because of probabilities. That is a real dilemma. You know, when do we not send an ambulance because our Fitbit and our car diagnostics say the probability of this person being alive when the ambulance arrives is only 0.01%. Do we waste the money and send the ambulance? And I would argue, as a human being, the ethics say the 0.01% is still enough. But that in the essence is the ethics of any form of data analysis. When does the computer say no?
Thank you, Clive, and thank you for that question, Mohammed. I think that brings us to the end, really, of our first masterclass, and I think we've finished on a very relevant, pertinent topic there, Clive. So I'd like to thank you very much, Clive, for being our first speaker in this program. It's been a fantastic session.